Alright guys, welcome to another video. Today we're doing a little bit of a documentary investigating what made meme specs from classic WoW, which were considered to be unviable, suddenly viable during the Burning Crusade. In case you didn't know, we are going to be talking about the Retribution Paladin, Ret Paladin, Shadow Priest, Enhancement Shaman, Elemental Shaman, Feral Druid Tank and DPS and Druid Moonkin specs in this video. I'm going to go through each and every spec individually and essentially evaluate which specific changes were crucial in making that spec more viable in a raiding environment. Overall, throughout my research, it's a mixture of things really. Some specs have mathematical buffs simply to make them stronger and it's pretty straightforward. Other specs had their issues simply fixed, mainly mana issues fixed with regeneration abilities. And then some classes simply got a total class mindset change. And in my opinion, the mindset for some of the classes in World of Warcraft during the Burning Crusades are in their best state compared to any other expansion. But anyway, before we jump into the meat and potatoes, if you want to catch any of my live streams guys, please do give me a quick follow on Twitch. But anyway, let's jump in. So to begin with, we're going to start talking about a spec I have the most experience with. I played Shadow Priest. So the main issues with Shadow Priest in Classic WoW was 1, they simply did low DPS, 2, they were very mana thirsty and just didn't have the sustainability and endurance to last for long boss fights. Basically, a Shadow Priest is your typical fresh university student. He's 18 years old, can't last more than 30 seconds in bed, and normally doesn't make it past pre-drinks. These issues were fixed in the Burning Crusade. So the first issue of low DPS. Your DPS was buffed with Vampiric Touch, which is essentially an extra dot. Obviously there's no debuff limit in the Burning Crusade, so you can put as many dots on as possible, which meant your DPS wasn't nerfed simply by the fact you can't use all of your abilities. Including this, there was also an execute ability, very similar to, well, execute for warriors, called Shadow Word Death, which again massively increased the DPS. Then the mana issue was very simply fixed with, first of all, reduced mana cost on your abilities. Then Vampiric Touch actually restored mana by a percentage of the damage you dealt, which increased your mana but also the raid's mana. Then you also had Shadow Fiend, which was a mana cooldown. Essentially it was a little bit, it's basically a temporary pet, kind of similar to the Water Elemental, which attacked the boss and regenerated your mana, very simple. And Blood Elves also had Consume Magic to restore their mana, including their actual normal, because that's the priest-specific racial, which was Consume Magic, which basically removed one of your buffs in order to restore mana, but then obviously they had their basic racials, which I can't remember the name of, which also regenerated mana. So they had a lot of tools to regenerate their mana. On top of this, the class philosophy and class mindset totally changed with the Burning Crusade. Well, it was more like built upon, because it did kind of exist in Classic WoW, but it was more built upon in the Burning Crusade, because the concept of a support class was more fleshed out, like it is in MMOs like the Lord of the Rings Online, because Shadow Priest became one of the best support classes in the game. They gave a raid mana health regeneration buff called Vampiric Embrace. Basically all the damage you do would cause an AoE heal on the entire raid. The same with Vampiric Touch, as I just mentioned, which was the same with mana. And then also you had Misery and Shadow Weaving, which debuff for targeting. Shadow Weaving increased the damage of Warlocks in the raid, but Misery would increase all the damage from the raid, or all spell damage. So overall, Shadow was a very useful spec in the Burning Crusade in a raiding environment. Most 25-man groups would at least bring 2 Shadow Priests because they were just so generally useful. And they were in extremely high demand. Even though you would only bring 2 to the raid, the thing is, not many people actually played Shadow Priest, so it would definitely not be difficult for you to get a raid spot. But the reason why they weren't stacked really high, like for instance, 4 or 5 mages, is because of that lack of DPS. Now let's move on to the Retribution Paladin, the class and spec I have the second most experience with. So the main issues that Retribution Paladin had during Classic was 1, a serious mana issue, because they would just run out of mana, and if they ran out of mana they wouldn't be able to maintain any threat. The second issue, they had no taunt, which was an absolute wind-up. Thirdly, they had no flat damage mitigation with their talents or mitigation cooldowns, which are essentially essential to smoothing out boss damage and also surviving hard-hitting boss abilities. So the first fix was Spiritual Attunement, which meant that 10% of the amount healed would equal mana regenerated on the Paladin. So 10% of the healing you received would be converted into mana, which was an absolute godsend. It was in the Burning Crusade, it was actually an ability that you got from the trainer rather than a talent, which was changed later in Wrath of the Lich King, so all paladins had this, and it was really, really useful. They were also given a flat damage mitigation buff with the improved Righteous Fury talent, which reduced your damage taken by 6%. You also had spell warding on top of that, which reduced the magic damage taken too. Holy Shield was also buffed slightly to increase the amount of charges it had, which again just further increased your survivability. On top of this, there were no mitigation cooldowns like Shield Wall and things like that, but it wasn't much of an issue because paladins had a talent called the Argent Defender, which meant you got a 30% damage reduction buff when you were less than 35% health, which more or less made it manageable, but at the end of the day it wasn't still as good as Warrior's ability to predict damage and pop a buff on before the big damage came, which meant Warriors were technically slightly better at tanks, but nonetheless Paladins were very, very viable, particularly in dungeons and particularly dealing with ads because they were the best AoE threat tanks in the game. Next, let's move on to the Retribution Paladin. So the issues with the Retribution Paladin during Classic was the damage was very good, but only in burst situations and not in sustained situations. So the damage would be very good in short time windows, which is good for PvP, but not good in a raiding environment, and that was largely to do with the fact they were also a very mana hungry spec, which meant again they just couldn't last long in longer raid fights. They essentially fixed this by adding Crusader Strike into the game, which made the DPS more of a sustained DPS, which was able to just hold its own in a long raid fight. They didn't really fix the mana cost reduction issues, but they did reduce the mana cost of certain spells, but it was kind of a little bit of an issue when you're in, well, beginner gear or pre-raid gear and stuff like that. But as the game kind of progressed, well, the expansion progressed and your intellect stat would increase and your mana pool increased, this became less of an issue. Although Rep Paladin was technically fixed during Burning Crusade, they kind of introduced a new issue, which was totally bizarre, by giving Blood Elf Paladins an exclusive ability called Seal of Blood. So Seal of Blood, what it would do is basically massively increase your holy damage at the cost of your health. So every time you did damage with this seal or with the judgment, you would essentially cause damage to yourself, which means as you're dealing damage to the boss, you're also dealing damage to yourself. But this wasn't much of an issue because you would get healed obviously by the healers, by the AoE healers and kind of like soft heals and things like that, which meant that as you're getting healed, you would benefit from Spiritual Attunement, which was the talent that we talked about before, which fit Protection Paladins, which meant you would gain a massive amount of mana regeneration by you essentially causing damage to yourself. Next, let's start talking about the Feral Druid, specifically the tank spec. So in all honesty, Druid tank during Classic WoW wasn't actually that bad. This has been largely proved by theory crafting, so Druid tanking wasn't actually that bad. The way I look at Druid tanks is that they are a huge meat bag kind of tank. They have a high health pool and a high armor rating. And during the Burning Crusade, they basically just became bigger meat bags, because Dial Bear form was buffed up from 360% of extra armor to 400% extra armor, and the health stat buff, which only gave you 600 extra health, was changed to 25% increased stamina, which meant it scaled as you got better and better gear. So yeah, overall they were just huge meat bags. So let's talk about Feral Druid DPS spec. Obviously the main issue with Feral Druid DPS was their simply very low DPS, but the main issue for that was because there was limited debuff slots, and Feral Druid basically didn't have the permission to have a debuff slot because it would be reserved for other classes, and that's largely the reason why Feral Druid did so little DPS during Classic WoW. However, if you have obviously that debuff limited removed, then Druids are able to apply more debuff, which massively increases their DPS. On top of this, the ability Mangle was totally reworked. It used to be kind of like a gouge ability, but then it got totally turned into a new main DPS ability, which increased the DPS of Druids massively. On top of this, mathematically they were also just buffed. And they also got a really cool AoE healing effect with Leader of the Pack buff, which originally only increased the critical strike chance of people in your group, but then it somehow changed to cause every single party member to do healing every time they critically hit on top of that. So their utility and their survivability and their support was also buffed as well. So again, they were considered a very useful spec to bring to any raid. Now let's move on to Moonkin. So the issues of Moonkin were, firstly, low damage, very plain and simple. This was largely because Moonfire ability was a mana hungry ability and they couldn't implement it into their rotation, which meant they could just spam Starfire, which didn't provide the best DPS. And you also couldn't use Innovate in Moonkin form, which again just made the mana issues even worse. The first thing they did to fix Moonkin was to add Dream State, which is a talent which very simply provides very passive, basic mana regeneration on a druid whenever they're doing anything. And they also generally buff their DPS and their utility, their debuffs and the buffs that they provide for our raid members. So again, they just became much stronger and a much more useful spec to provide to bring to any raiding environment. Lastly, we're going to finish off talking about the Shaman and their two specs, Enhancement and Elemental. So the main issue with Enhancement Shaman was basically the same as the Retribution Paladin. The damage was not sustained damage and it was very RNG based, so you would only do DPS, again, good DPS in small time windows if the RNG gods were in your favour. They fixed this by giving Enhancement Shamans dual wield, which made the damage more stable and reliable and more sustained. And also again, they had a massive mindset change similar to Shadow Priest, where they became much more of a support class. They did provide massively useful buffs like Wind Fury Totem, Wrath of the Air Totem, and they also provided Bloodlust and Heroism, which would only be specific to a single party, so it could only buff 4 other people including yourself, which meant that Shamans were in massively high demand during a Burning Crusade, because you couldn't just bring one Shaman and buff the entire raid with one Bloodlust. So let's finish with the Elemental Shaman. Big issues with the Elemental Shaman was it's basically the same thing. We had massively good burst damage, but it wasn't very sustained, very mana hungry, and we didn't have lots in the way of mana regeneration. Also, nature damage did not benefit from Warlock debuffs, so a lot of their spells got resisted, which was obviously very, very annoying. So the first thing they did to fix Elemental Shaman was to fix their mana issues. They gave them a passive mana regeneration ability very similar to the Druid's Dream State ability, which was called Unrelenting Storm, so very flat out, very basic passive mana regeneration. They also gave them a clear casting ability, which meant that every time you crit, the next 2 spells would have their mana cost reduced, which meant that, the reason why this became so powerful is because Shamans already got a ridiculous amount of crit chance statically from their talents, which meant they didn't have to stack that much crit chance from their gear to have a really high crit chance to again benefit from this clear casting effect, which meant they were very, very mana efficient DPS. So overall, the DPS Shaman specs were very, very viable and very strong during the Burning Crusade and very desirable, mainly because of that Bloodlust ability, especially on the caster DPS, as I've heard, as Bloodlust would be prioritised on caster DPS because it would obviously massively increase the speed of their casting time, which again massively boosts the DPS of the entire raid. And that's pretty much where I'm going to end the video, guys. Obviously there are even bigger meme specs out there, like Spelladins or Shockadins, whatever you want to call them, and Warlock tanks and stuff like that, but I guess they would probably, because they didn't become that viable during, actually to be honest, the Warlock tank did become viable in particular fights during Burning Crusade, which, anyway, those kind of things, those kind of topics essentially need their own video, and look forward to that kind of thing coming soon. But nonetheless, my name is MetaGoblin. To my next video, ciao.